The wheels hit tarmac with a hollow thud that climbed through the fuselage and settled in my teeth. For a moment I forgot to breathe. The pilot flared hard, the engine roar softened, and the cabin drifted into that strange, weightless silence that means a journey is ending and something heavier is about to begin. After 18 months in Afghanistan, I had learned the language of machines and weather and distance. Home, by comparison, felt like a dialect I used to speak fluently, but hadn't practiced in too long. People clapped. Someone cried out a name that wasn't mine. Seatbelts snapped open in a jittering chorus. I kept my hands flat on my thighs until I was sure the ground beneath us would not move again. The smell in the cabin shifted from burnt jet fuel to wool coats, citrus hand sanitizer, and the faint sweetness of old coffee. None of it belonged to the desert, which meant all of it belonged to a life I had promised myself I still had. I stepped into the jet bridge with my rucksack slung high. The fabric rasped against my sleeve. Small sound, but sharp enough to make me flinch. In the deployment zone, every small sound meant something. A zipper at night, a pebble skidding down a wadi, breath fogging in the wrong direction. Out here it was just tired people and the slap of shoes on rubber flooring. Still my mind kept tagging, categorizing, building a threat map that had nowhere to go. At the terminal, families were already forming islands of noise. Balloons, flags, camera phones, little monuments to a reunion that felt like a simple miracle. I scanned faces the way I had scanned ridgelines, left to right, up and down, slow and systematic. I knew exactly what I was looking for. Her hair pulled back, that soft half-smile she wore when she was nervous, the dimple that only showed on the right side when she tried not to cry. I found none of it. Traffic, I told myself. A delay, a wrong turn, a missed exit, something small and ordinary. I texted landing. The message showed, as delivered, no typing bubbles. I pictured her running across the living room, grabbing keys, fumbling with the lock, cursing at herself because she wanted everything to be perfect. The thought warmed me like a sip of something strong. I held on to it the way I had held on to certain memories overseas. A lake at dusk, cicadas, the smell of rain on hot pavement, little anchors you drop in rough water. Outside, winter air bit my cheeks. A taxi's brakes squealed. A gust dragged newspaper across the curb. I slid into the back seat of a car that smelled faintly of pine and fried food. The driver glanced at me in the mirror, eyebrows lifting at the uniform. "Homecoming?" he asked. I nodded. "Long time," I said. "Too long." He didn't ask anything else, which I appreciated. Questions are doors. Silence is a hallway. I needed a hallway. City lights unspooled like a necklace in the dark. We passed storefronts I used to know, restaurants that had changed their names, a mural I didn't remember, new colors bleeding over old brick. Everything evolves when you're gone. Even the streets learn to carry themselves differently. I tried to measure the distance between the man who had left and the one who was pressing his thumb into the edge of a dog tag in the back of a taxi, counting breaths like he was still timing a patrol. I thought about the first night we met, a bad band at a bar that smelled like lime and spilled beer. She laughed at my terrible joke and then apologized for laughing, which made me laugh, which made the bartender laugh, and somewhere in the middle of all that noise we carved out a quiet that felt like ours. Later, when I got my orders, she traced the map with a fingertip as if she could memorize the shape of absence. "Come back to me," she said. I promised. I meant it. Promises are easy to pack. They take no space and weigh everything. My phone buzzed once, spam, not her. I set it face down. The driver turned onto our street. My street. Windows I recognized blinked behind curtains I didn't. A neighbor's porch had a new swing, painted blue. There was a different car in the driveway across the way, dusted with salt. Details stacked themselves in my head like bricks. Observation is a reflex that doesn't ask permission. We stopped in front of my house, porch light burning, 2 steps in need of new paint. The wind chime we never hung because we used to joke it sounded like a warning bell. I paid the driver and stood on the sidewalk longer than I should have, the way you do when you've reached a destination but your body hasn't caught up with your belief. My breath lifted in pale ghosts. I could have called her name. I didn't. Instead, I listened. In Afghanistan, night has its own gravity. You learn to read it. You learn that silence is a texture, that emptiness has edges. Here the silence was suburban, a distant television, tires whispering on wet asphalt, a dog deciding whether to bark. Underneath, something else. Not sound. Not exactly. A disturbance in the pattern, like a scarf snagging on a nail you didn't see. It was nothing. It was everything. It made the small muscles along my spine tighten as if on command. I slid the key into the lock and paused. The metal was cold. The door gave slightly before the latch clicked, as if it had been closed in a hurry and hadn't quite settled into its frame. Inside, warmth breathed over my face. Detergent, coffee, her perfume diluted by time. My rucksack thumped down in the hallway with a sound that felt too loud. I whispered, "I'm home," to no one, and to the walls and to whatever part of me had needed to hear it most. The living room was tidy in the way you straighten a room when you expect someone to look, but not stay. Coasters stacked, a blanket folded with intention on the arm of the couch. A candle burned low to the point where wick and wax become a single black mark. On the counter, a mug waiting, clean but turned upside down. Habit, not hospitality. These are the kinds of clues that mean nothing to anyone else and an entire story to a soldier who has catalogued doorways by bullet scarring. I touched the back of the chair she always used. Running a thumb over the groove, worn into the wood, my hand came away dusty. I smiled because dust is honest. It tells you how long something has been still. My phone buzzed again. Another spam call that somehow sounded like a missed heartbeat. I turned it off. A house at night is a country. Each room has borders, customs, a language they speak with light and shadow. I moved through it quietly, passport stamped by memory. At the bedroom door, I stopped. Not because of a sound, I still couldn't name one, but because of that slight pressure in the chest, that tilt of the inner compass that had kept me alive more than once. 18 months of training sharpened by 18 lifetimes crammed into a year and a half. You learn to trust the alarms you can't explain. You learn to respect what your bones know before your brain agrees. My hand hovered over the doorknob. I remembered a firefight that started with nothing, a bird lifting off a wall too quickly, a shadow that didn't match its source. We survived because we believed the unbelievable in time to move. I swallowed hard. The brass was warmer than the key had been, as if a hand had held it recently. I told myself it was mine, leftover heat from the hallway. I told myself a lot of things. I turned the knob, and then I heard it. Finally, an actual sound to wrap my instinct around. Not loud, not obvious. Just a fraction of a whisper followed by a breath trying hard not to be one. The kind of almost noise that makes every nerve in your body stand up and look. In that instant, the desert came back to me. The smell of cordite, the grit in my teeth, the way time slows when it understands it's about to matter. I pushed the door open, inch by inch. The way you open a memory you're afraid will prove you wrong. What waited on the other side would redraw the map of my life, but in that last second of not knowing, I stood in the doorway like a man whose war had ended, not yet aware another one was already in the room. I didn't sleep that first night. Not because of the jet lag, not because of the time difference, but because of the way the air in the house felt heavier than it should. You can tell when a space has held more than just furniture and shadows. A house, like a battlefield, absorbs the presence of those who pass through it. In smells, in heat, in the way certain things seem displaced. Lying on my back in the dark, I replayed the sound I'd heard before opening the bedroom door. I told myself it was the pipes, I told myself it was the wind, but the problem with telling yourself stories is that you still know when you're lying. Years in the military teach you to read silence as fluently as speech, and that whisper I'd caught wasn't the silence of an empty room. The next morning, she was already up. Coffee brewing, hair done, too done for a Saturday. She smiled like she hadn't seen me in over a year. Because she hadn't. But there was something behind her eyes, a flicker that didn't match the warmth in her voice. "You were out cold last night," she said. I nodded and sipped the coffee she handed me, wondering if she noticed the way my hands didn't shake anymore. War cures you of certain weaknesses, but it also replaces them with other kinds. Paranoia, for example. In the service, it keeps you alive. Back home, it can eat you from the inside. Still, I couldn't ignore the small tells. Her phone never left her side. Text alerts she'd glance at and swipe away before I could see. Calls she'd taken another room with the door almost, but not quite, closed. Over the next week, patterns emerged, and patterns are dangerous things to spot when you already suspect betrayal. She started working late twice a week, even though I knew her schedule hadn't changed. She avoided certain topics, steering conversations toward trivial things. A new series on TV, a neighbor's dog. Anything but us. When I asked her if she wanted to go out, she'd hesitate before saying she was tired. It was in those pauses that I heard the truth trying to breathe. One evening, she came home smelling faintly of cologne. Not mine. I didn't mention it. I just logged it away in the quiet ledger I kept in my head. Soldiers keep two kinds of records, the official ones you report and the ones you write in blood and instinct. This was the second kind. I started watching her without making it obvious. The way she'd check the time more often than usual. How her laughter was louder when she texted than when we spoke face to face. And how sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, she'd seem almost guilty. Not sad. Guilty. I tried to convince myself it was my mind playing tricks. After all, reintegration into civilian life isn't smooth. You're trained for chaos, then dropped into calm, and sometimes you invent threats because you don't know how to live without them. But every detail, every glance, every change in routine was a dot on a map that I knew would eventually lead somewhere I didn't want to go. One afternoon, I came back earlier than she expected. The blinds were half closed, and I saw movement through the gap. Not her silhouette, but someone taller, broader. My pulse slowed, not sped up, slowed, the way it does right before a firefight. I stepped quietly onto the porch, but before I could turn the handle, I heard footsteps inside, fast and deliberate. By the time I entered, she was alone in the kitchen, flushed and startled, with an excuse ready before I even asked. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, tracing invisible lines between all the moments that didn't make sense. Somewhere in that web was the answer, and I was starting to realize that the man at the other end of it was someone I knew. And then, like a round hitting its mark, the thought struck, my brother-in-law. Once the idea took root, it spread like wildfire through my thoughts. My brother-in-law, her sister's husband, had always been a presence in our lives. Holidays, barbecues, birthdays. He was there, with that easy smile and a handshake that felt solid enough to trust. We'd shared beers on the back porch, swapped stories about work, even talked about things I'd never bring up with most men. He was family, and that fact alone made the suspicion feel toxic. Almost impossible. Almost. But suspicion changes the way you see the past. I started replaying memories like a soldier rewinding surveillance footage, slowing down frames, looking for the moment the truth slipped through. I remembered the way they hugged that Christmas before my deployment. A second too long, maybe nothing, maybe everything. I remembered the times they'd share inside jokes at the table, laughing while I sat there smiling, not understanding. And there was that one look he'd given her during a summer barbecue, when I'd turned away and caught him in my peripheral vision. Something in his eyes that wasn't casual. At the time, I'd brushed it off. Now every one of those moments was a crack in the wall I'd been blind to. Soldiers don't act on feelings alone. In the field, guessing gets people killed. At home, it can destroy lives. I needed confirmation, solid evidence. So I waited, patient as I'd been on Overwatch, letting the days run their course until she gave me the opportunity I was looking for. It came one Wednesday evening. She told me she had to work late again. No hesitation, no eye contact, just a quick kiss on the cheek before grabbing her purse. I nodded, said nothing, and let her leave. I watched from the window as her taillights disappeared down the street. Then I grabbed my jacket, slid into my car, and followed. 2 cars back, no sudden moves, keeping far enough to blend into the flow of traffic. She didn't take the route to her office. I knew it by heart. I'd driven it enough times to surprise her with lunch back when things felt real between us. Instead, she cut across town, heading into a quiet neighborhood where the streetlights seemed to work every other block. My chest tightened when I realized where we were. She turned onto a familiar street and slowed. I killed my headlights before rounding the corner, letting the shadows swallow my car. She pulled into a driveway I knew almost as well as my own. His driveway, my brother-in-law's house. For a moment, the sight didn't register. I just stared at her car parked there, the reflection of the porch light on its hood, the outline of her in the driver's seat. The hit, when it came, was physical, a blow to the sternum. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles felt like they might split. I waited. Minutes passed. The cold air in my car felt heavier with each breath. No one came out. No one came in. I opened the door quietly and stepped out, my boots whispering against the asphalt. The night was still except for the distant hum of a TV somewhere and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Training takes over at times like that. You move slow, calculate every angle. I stayed low, using the line of hedges as cover until I had a view of the side window. The curtains were drawn, but not all the way. Through the narrow gap, I saw them. Her on the couch. Him beside her, too close for any innocent explanation. Her hand rested casually on his thigh as though it belonged there. His arm hung over her shoulders, fingers brushing her hair with an intimacy that hit me harder than any firefight ever had. They weren't talking. They weren't watching TV. They were just there, comfortable, settled. Like this was a place they had been many times before. Like they didn't have to pretend when no one was watching. I felt something inside me shut down. Not rage. Not even shock. Just silence. A clean, cold emptiness. The same kind I'd felt in the seconds before an ambush overseas, when instinct told me that whatever happened next would change everything. I stepped back from the window, forcing my breathing into slow, steady rhythms. In the field, losing control gets you killed. Here, it would do something else entirely. I retreated into the darkness, made my way back to my car, and sat there until my pulse returned to something close to normal. Then I drove home. I didn't call her. I didn't send a message. I just waited in the dark living room, the clock ticking louder with each second, until I heard her key in the door hours later. She walked in, smiling like she'd been somewhere ordinary. "Long day," she said, hanging up her coat, a coat that smelled faintly of his cologne. I asked her how work had gone. She didn't hesitate. "Busy." Then she kissed me on the forehead, like she always used to, and went to shower. I sat there, still as stone, memorizing the sound of the water running and the distance between us. That night I lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling. I could hear her breathing, slow and even. I memorized it. Not because it brought me peace, but because it was the last time I would hear it without knowing the truth. The battlefield had moved, and this one was inside my own home. There's a moment after you've confirmed the worst, when time feels different. It doesn't slow down like people say. It hardens. Every second becomes a solid thing you can pick up, turn over, and feel the weight of. That's how the next few days passed for me. Heavy, deliberate, unbreakable. I didn't confront her. Not yet. In war, you learn there's no point charging at the first sight of the enemy. You watch. You wait. You gather intel until you know every move they'll make before they make it. This was no different, except the battlefield was my living room and the enemy was someone I once swore to protect. Every morning, she acted like nothing had changed. She'd kiss me before leaving for work, ask if I needed anything from the store. She even laughed at a joke I made over breakfast, though her laughter felt like an echo, a sound recorded somewhere else and played here without meaning. I watched her, every gesture and glance, storing them away the way I used to memorize the terrain before a patrol. At night, I'd lie awake, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling plaster. My mind drifted to Afghanistan, to nights when the cold would settle into your bones, and the only thing keeping you from falling asleep forever was the thought of what you had to do in the morning. You learned discipline out there. You learned patience. You learned that the difference between walking away and not walking at all can be the smallest hesitation. I began preparing like it was a mission, not out of impulse but out of necessity. I cleaned my service weapon, not because it needed cleaning, but because the ritual calmed me. Every click of a magazine locking in place, every smooth slide of the barrel under a cloth, it grounded me, made me remember who I was before betrayal turned me into this version of myself. I also thought about consequences. I thought about my career, my record, the life I'd built piece by piece. And I thought about how easily she and he had decided I was worth less than a few stolen hours in a darkened room. I thought about loyalty, how in uniform you'd take a bullet for the man next to you knowing he'd do the same. And how here in the civilian world, people seem to throw loyalty away like it was nothing more than a worn-out shirt. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the ease with which they lived it, the way they could smile at me across a table, clink glasses at a family dinner, and then vanish into the shadows together as soon as my back was turned. That took calculation. That took nerve. And that meant they'd never stop unless I made them. So I started imagining scenarios, how it might play out. In my mind, I replayed them over and over, each one sharper than the last. Where I'd stand, what I'd say, how they'd react when they realized the rules of this engagement had changed. These weren't fantasies. They were rehearsals. Training. A soldier doesn't improvise when the stakes are life and death. I also noticed her slipping further away from me. She answered texts slower. Her smile when I came home was smaller, rehearsed. Some nights she'd sit beside me on the couch, scrolling through her phone, barely glancing up. I could almost feel her counting the hours until she could leave again. I didn't tell her I knew. Let her think she was invisible. Let her believe she was still in control. But inside, something had shifted. That soldier's instinct, the one that had saved me in places no one back home could imagine, was awake and fully alert. It told me there was only one way this would end, and it wouldn't be with a conversation over coffee. The night before it happened, I slept less than 2 hours. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind was too focused, too clear. I moved through the house in silence, each creak of the floorboard mapping itself into memory. I checked the weapon again. I loaded what needed to be loaded. Every movement felt like part of a slow, inevitable march toward something I'd been walking toward since the moment I saw them together. At dawn, I stood at the kitchen window, watching the frost melt off the grass. The air was so still it felt wrong. Somewhere deep inside, a voice, my voice, told me this was the last morning things would ever look the way they did now. And I believed it. I remember the sound before I remember anything else. Not shouting, not panic, just the sound of my own breathing, steady, controlled. The way it had been on patrols where a single mistake meant a flag over your coffin. I had timed it perfectly. I knew her schedule. I knew his. When she said she was running errands that morning, I told her I'd be busy cleaning out the garage. She smiled, kissed me lightly, and walked out the door. Minutes later, I was in my truck, following her at a distance I'd practiced in my mind for days. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't pound. It was the same cold focus I'd felt before raids overseas, the quiet certainty that what you were about to do would change everything, and you had already accepted it. She drove straight to his house, no hesitation, no second glance in the mirror. I parked a street away, got out, and approached on foot. The winter air stung my face, but I hardly felt it. My boots made almost no sound on the cracked pavement. Through the gap in his curtains, the scene was almost identical to the one I'd seen before. The two of them together, laughing at something only they understood. Her hand rested on his knee this time, not his thigh. It didn't matter. The intimacy was the same. I didn't kick the door open like in the movies. I knocked, 3 times. Slow, measured. When the door swung open, his smile froze halfway, like a man who just realized the storm he'd been ignoring was already in his living room. I stepped inside without asking. My eyes never left hers. She tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. He moved slightly, maybe to stand between us, maybe to get closer to her. I'll never know. The rest happened fast. Actions you've rehearsed in your head never feel improvised when the moment comes. They just happen. My training took over. My service weapon was in my hand before either of them could close the distance. My voice was steady when I told them to sit. They didn't move at first, but the look in my eyes must have told them I wasn't asking twice. I don't remember shouting. I don't remember threats. I remember asking one question: how long? Her answer didn't matter. The moment her mouth opened, I already knew the truth. What happened next is between me, them, and the four walls of that house. I'm not here to give you details that'll turn this into another piece of gossip to pass around. All I'll say is this: in war, there are missions you walk away from and missions you don't. That morning was one I was never going to walk away from unchanged. By the time I stepped back outside, the sun was higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. My hands were steady as I set the weapon down on the passenger seat. The frost on the grass was gone. The cold in my chest wasn't. People think the worst part of betrayal is the moment you discover it. They're wrong. The worst part is living afterward, knowing that the people you trusted most could smile to your face while driving a knife into your back. In the military, betrayal means death. Out here, it just means you keep breathing while something inside you is already gone. I didn't go back home that day. I drove for hours, past towns I'd never been to, past gas stations and diners and empty fields. Somewhere along the road, I realized I wasn't thinking about her anymore. I was thinking about how 18 months in a war zone hadn't broken me. But this had. And maybe that's the part no one tells you. That sometimes the battle you survive leaves wounds deeper than the ones you fought overseas. You can train for the enemy you see coming. You can't train for the one who shares your bed. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell it because someone out there needs to hear it. You can survive the worst of humanity on the other side of the world and still be blindsided by it in your own home. In war, you fight for the man beside you. At home, you fight to remember who you are when the people you love take that away. And I'll be fighting that battle for the rest of my life.